Once upon a time, in the quiet rhythm of a world long gone, the life of a medieval peasant unfolded with a steady simplicity that may seem unbearably dull to us today, but within that dullness lies a kind of gentle, almost hypnotic repetition. Tonight, you will drift into that world. You will walk with the peasant as he wakes with the sun, as he bends his back to the soil, as he eats the same meals again and again, as he counts the passing seasons not with excitement but with patience. This is not the story of kings or knights or great battles. It is the story of ordinary people whose lives were spent in fields, in cottages, in the endless tasks of survival. And as you listen, as the details stretch and linger, you may find the slow rhythm lulling you deeper into rest, because this history is boring in the best possible way. It is made for sleep. The peasant wakes before dawn, not because he wants to, but because the rooster calls, and the rhythm of work begins long before the sky lightens. There is no soft bed to rise from, no mattress stuffed with feathers, no blanket woven with finery. Instead, a simple straw mattress rests upon a wooden frame, and the straw, after months of use, smells faintly of dust and dampness. If he is fortunate, it has been recently replaced. If not, small insects share the bed with him, and he hardly notices any more. He rises, rubbing his eyes, stretching limbs that ache not from age, but from constant labor. Outside, the air is cool and heavy with dew, and the mist clings low to the ground. His home is not much to speak of, but it shelters him. A simple wattle and daub structure, its walls made of sticks woven together and plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. The roof is thatched, a dense layering of reeds or straw tied carefully, angled to keep out the rain as best it can. Sometimes the thatch leaks, and buckets or clay pots must be set beneath the dripping points, but for now the roof holds. The single room is dark even in the day, and at this hour it is almost pitch black. The hearth at the center of the floor has long gone cold from the night, and he kneels to stir the ashes, hoping to coax a small ember to life. If one remains, he feeds it with twigs, blowing gently until the faint glow becomes a flame. If none remain, he must strike flint against iron until sparks catch on dry tinder. This small act, repeated endlessly, is how each day begins, with fire. The peasant does not wake alone. His wife, if he has one, stirs beside him, wrapping a shawl about her shoulders. Children, if they are present, curl on the floor near the hearth, bundled in whatever scraps of cloth can be spared. They too will rise with the sun, for in the life of a peasant, every hand, no matter how small, is put to use. The animals stir as well. A pig grunts from its pen outside, chickens shuffle and cluck softly, and if the household is fortunate, a cow waits patiently to be milked. Breakfast is not a feast. It is never a feast. It is a simple meal of pottage, yesterday's. Stew thickened with barley, peas, beans, or cabbage, left to simmer and thicken until it becomes a heavy, filling paste. It is eaten with coarse bread made of rye or barley, dark and dense, not the soft white loaves reserved for the wealthy. If there is ale left from the brewing, they drink that, for water from the well may be unclean. This is not a special meal. This is every morning, every day, repeated until the memory of variety fades into nothingness. When the meal is finished, the work begins. The peasant steps out into the fields, tools in hand. The tools are simple: a wooden plow, a hoe, perhaps, a sickle or scythe, depending on the season. Iron is costly, and tools must be shared or carefully maintained, handed down from generation to generation. The land is not his own, not truly. It belongs to the Lord, and he works it in exchange for the right to live on it, to keep a portion of its yield, and to survive. Each day is spent bending, digging, sowing, reaping, depending on the time of year. There is little variation, little excitement, only the steady cycle of seasons. Spring means planting, Summer means tending. Autumn means harvest. Winter means endurance. The hours are long. In summer, he begins at dawn and labors until dusk, pausing only for the midday meal. A simple affair, perhaps more pottage, perhaps bread with onions, perhaps a bit of cheese if the household is fortunate. Meat is rare, very rare. A chicken might be eaten only on feast days or perhaps a pig at Christmastide. Most of the time, meat is preserved through salting or smoking and reserved for times of necessity. The rest of the time, the peasant eats vegetables, grains, and legumes, filling food that sustains but never delights. The children, too, are put to work. They scare birds from the fields, fetch water from the well, gather firewood from the forest, or care for the animals. Childhood, as we understand it, does not exist here. From the moment they are old enough to walk, they are given tasks, small at first, then larger, until they too are full laborers. If they survive infancy, and many do not, they will live as their parents lived, with little hope of escape from the cycle of toil. The peasant's world is narrow. His village is small, a cluster of cottages and a church at its heart. The church is perhaps the one building of stone, cool and solid, its bell calling the villagers to prayer, to mass, to confession. Religion is not a part of life. It is life itself. Every day, every week, every season is marked by holy days, feasts, and fasts. The peasant knows little of the world beyond his village, but he knows the saints, the prayers, the rituals. These give order to his existence. Festivals are rare but deeply treasured. Harvest celebrations, midsummer feasts, Christmas, Easter, these are the few days when work pauses, when ale flows more freely, when music and dancing fill the village square. Yet even these are modest compared to the celebrations of the nobility. For the peasant, joy is measured in small moments. A full belly after a hard day, the laughter of children, a successful harvest, a warm fire in winter. As the day stretches on, the work continues. The sun moves across the sky, shadows lengthen, and muscles ache. The peasant wipes sweat from his brow, dirt from his hands, and continues. To stop is to fall behind, and to fall behind is to risk hunger. There is no wealth stored away, no savings, no safety net. Survival depends on constant effort, on the willingness to endure. Evening brings another meal, not much different from the first. Pottage again, perhaps thickened with whatever vegetables were available, perhaps flavored with herbs from the garden. Bread again, coarse and dark, ale again, if it remains. Then the family gathers around the hearth, the only source of light and warmth, to talk, to tell stories, to mend clothing, to prepare for another day. There is no candlelight, except perhaps a single tallow candle for special use, for such things are costly. The night is dark, and so life is lived in rhythm with the sun. When sleep comes, it comes early. The peasant lies again on his straw mattress, pulls a rough wool blanket over himself and drifts into rest, knowing that tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. The sameness is crushing, yet it is also soothing. Life does not change quickly here. It moves at the pace of the seasons, the rhythm of planting and harvest, the endless repetition of survival. And so, as you listen, you may feel that sameness settling over you too. The steady rhythm of work, of meals, of prayers, of sleep. It does not rush. It does not change suddenly. It simply continues, like the turning of the earth, like the passage of the sun. The peasant's life is painfully ordinary, but in that ordinariness lies a strange kind of peace. The fields stretch far beyond the village, yet they are not endless. Each strip of land belongs not to the peasant, but to the lord of the manor. The peasants do not own the soil they till. They are tenants, bound by obligation. Some pay rent, in coin, though coin is scarce. More often they pay in labor, working not only their own strips of land, but also the domain, the portion of the manor reserved for the lord. On certain days of the week, they must put aside their own work to labor for him, plowing, sowing, reaping, repairing fences, gathering wood, or tending animals. It is called corvée, and it is owed without question. To refuse is unthinkable, punishable not just by fines, but by exile from the village. And to be cast out is worse than death, for survival without community is impossible. The peasant accepts this quietly. He has never known anything else. The Lord is distant, often away at another estate or even at war. The steward or bailiff enforces his will, walking through the fields, checking the work, recording dues. These men are not loved, but they are obeyed. If grain is owed, it is measured carefully. If chickens or eggs are part of the rent, they are counted. If firewood is required, it is delivered. Everything has its price, and the peasant pays in the only currency he has, his labor. Even when the land is his to use, the peasant's freedom is narrow. He cannot hunt the forests freely. The deer, the boar, even the rabbits belong to the Lord. To be caught poaching could mean harsh punishment, even death. Gathering firewood is permitted, but only the fallen branches, never the living trees. Even the rivers and ponds may be restricted, with fishing rights controlled. And so, the peasant's diet remains humble, his life tightly bounded by law and custom, his world enclosed not only by the village borders, but by rules he cannot change. Clothing, too, tells of his station. He wears wool, coarse and undyed, a simple tunic belted at the waist, trousers of rough cloth, leather shoes if he can afford them, though often he goes barefoot in the fields. In winter, he layers heavier cloaks, but warmth is never guaranteed. His wife wears a simple dress of the same wool, with an apron tied about her waist, her head covered by a wimple or kerchief. There is no fashion here, only necessity. Clothes are patched, repatched, handed down until they fall to pieces. Only the Lord and his family wear bright colors, fine fabrics, embroidery. The peasant watches such finery from afar, as unattainable, as the stars. When sickness comes, as it often does, there is little to be done. Herbs from the hedgerow, charms from the wise woman, prayers to the saints, these are the remedies. A fever may pass, or it may take a life. Childbirth is dangerous, and many women die in it. Infants perish often, their tiny graves scattered around the churchyard. The peasant knows loss intimately, yet he does not dwell on it. Life continues because it must. The fields do not stop, the animals must still be fed, and the seasons march on regardless of grief. And yet, for all its hardship, the peasant's life is not without moments of contentment. A cool drink from the well after hours of work beneath the summer sun. The sound of laughter when stories are told around the hearth. A good harvest that fills the granary, enough to see the family through winter. The bells of the church ringing, on a holy day, calling the village together in shared prayer. These moments are small, but they are everything. Night descends slowly, the sky dimming to shades of deep blue, then black, pierced by stars. The peasant knows nothing of astronomy, nothing of planets or distant suns, but he knows the patterns of the constellations. He knows when Orion rises, when the Pleiades fade, when the moon is full or new. These guide his work, his planting, his harvest. They are the clock by which he lives, more reliable than any device of gears or bells. He lies again upon his straw bed, the day's weariness pressing upon him, and he sleeps. Tomorrow will be the same meals, the same fields, the same prayers, the same aches, the same quiet endurance. His life is painfully ordinary, and in that ordinariness lies the slow, steady heartbeat of a world that endured for centuries, unchanged and unchanging. And as you listen, as the details stretch into sameness, you may find your own heartbeat slowing too, lulled by the rhythm of repetition. Morning begins once more, as it always does, not with excitement, but with necessity. The roosters crow, the shifting of animals in the yard, the faint stirring of the household. These are the peasant's alarm clock. The fire has gone out. Again, and it must be rekindled, for without it there is no warmth, no cooking, no light. The act of making fire is so familiar it is nearly mechanical. The striking of flint on steel, the shower of sparks, the patient coaxing of tinder until the faintest thread of smoke appears. Breath after gentle breath, the ember glows, then flickers into flame. It is the same every morning, the same motion, the same quiet struggle against darkness. The children wake with the light, rubbing their eyes, their hair tousled from sleeping on rough bedding near the hearth. They do not wake to play, but to work. One is sent to fetch water from the village well, carrying a wooden bucket with a handle that digs into small hands. Another is tasked with gathering eggs from the chickens, if any have been laid. Another tends to the pig, ensuring it has enough scraps to keep it from growing restless. Childhood is brief, barely recognized. A child of 7 is already part of the working household, expected to share in the burdens as naturally as breathing. The first meal of the day is the same once more. Pottage, thickened and reheated from the night before. Bread, dense and dark, sometimes hard enough to require soaking in ale or broth before it can be chewed. If there is a bit of milk, it may be stirred in to soften the flavor. Sweetness is rare, honey is costly, sugar nearly unknown. The peasant does not crave it, for he has scarcely tasted it. Hunger shapes taste, and fullness is the greatest luxury. With food eaten, tools are gathered. A wooden-handled hoe, a crude spade, perhaps an iron-tipped plow if fortune smiles. The oxen are led from their pen, their great heads bowed as they trudge into the fields. They are as essential to survival as the family itself, slow and stubborn, yet capable of pulling the plow through the heavy earth. The peasant guides them patiently, step after weary step, as the soil turns in furrows behind them. It is exhausting work, and it must be done day after day until the fields are prepared. The fields themselves are not his to shape freely. They are organized in long, narrow strips, divided among the villagers in a system that seems chaotic to the modern eye, but is well understood by those who live within it. Each man holds scattered strips across the open fields, ensuring that good and poor land are shared evenly. Boundaries are marked not by fences, but by memory, by small stones or stakes, by the collective understanding of where one man's soil ends and another's begins. It is a fragile order, upheld not by written contracts, but by the weight of tradition. At midday, the sun is high, and the peasant pauses for the second meal. It is little more than the first. Bread, pottage, perhaps, some cheese or an onion pulled fresh from the garden. The food is filling enough to quiet the stomach, but never luxurious. He eats sitting upon the earth, his back resting against a tree or fence, while the oxen graze nearby. The children, too, eat quickly, then return to their smaller tasks, chasing, crows from the grain, carrying tools, gathering firewood from the hedgerows. The work continues until the sun lowers. He bends, straightens, bends again, his muscles straining against the monotony of endless labor. The soil stains his hands, his tunic, his face. He is not bitter. This is simply life. It has always been this way, for his father, his grandfather, and countless generations before. He does not imagine it changing, nor does he long for adventure. The horizon of his world is the village, the church, the Lord's manor house. Beyond that lies rumor and hearsay, tales told by travelers and merchants, but never seen with his own eyes. Evening falls at last. The tools are set aside, the oxen led back to their pen. A thin smoke rises from chimneys across the village as hearths are lit once more. The peasant enters his cottage, the smell of cooking filling the dim space. Tonight's meal is once again pottage, perhaps with cabbage and beans, perhaps flavored with a scrap of salted pork if such a luxury remains. The bread is shared among all, torn into pieces, dipped into the stew. Ale, brewed at home from barley, provides both drink and nourishment. After the meal, the family gathers by the fire. The children sit cross-legged on the floor, listening as their parents tell stories, legends of saints, tales of far-off lands, or perhaps simple riddles passed down from one generation to the next. Storytelling is not for entertainment alone. It is how knowledge survives, how memory is preserved. The flickering firelight casts long shadows on the walls, and outside, the night settles heavy upon the land. When sleep comes, it comes quickly. There is no distraction, no glowing lamp, no written book to delay the end of the day. The body, exhausted from labor, yields to rest without struggle. The peasant closes his eyes, and the rhythm continues. Work, eat, pray, sleep, repeat. Each day is almost indistinguishable from the last, and in that sameness lies both hardship and peace. The rhythm of village life is not measured in hours, but in seasons. Time is not told by clocks, for no such thing exists here. Instead, it is told by the length of shadows, the position of the sun, the turning of the year from cold to warmth, and back again. The peasant knows spring when the thaw softens the earth, when the buds begin to form upon the hedgerows, when the birds return to the fields. He knows summer when the days stretch endlessly, when the heat bakes the soil, when the grain rises tall. He knows autumn when the air cools, when the leaves turn gold and fall, when the harvest must be gathered in haste before the frost. He knows winter when the fields lie bare, when the hearth becomes the center of life, when the days are short and survival itself is the only concern. In spring, there is hope. The plowing begins, furrows stretching in neat lines, seed cast by hand covered with soil. The work is exhausting, but it carries the promise of growth, of food to come. The children follow their parents, scattering stones from the fields, driving away birds that would devour the seed. There is a rhythm to the sowing, a chant almost, as hands move steadily, as backs bend and straighten again. It is back-breaking, but it is also renewal. Summer brings labor without rest. Weeds must be pulled, fields tended, animals watched. The days are long, stretching from the pale light of dawn until the fading glow of dusk. Sweat soaks tunics, dirt, cakes hands and feet, and yet there is no end. The grain ripens slowly, teasing with its promise until at last it is ready. The harvest must be gathered quickly, before rain spoils it, before wind scatters it, before rot sets in. Men and women alike swing sickles, cutting stalks in great bundles, stacking them high, thrashing them later to free the grain. The air is filled with dust, with the sound of tools striking, with the murmured chants of labor. The harvest is joy, for it brings food, but it is also burden, for it demands everything. Autumn is both relief and fear. The granaries are filled, the barns packed with straw, the salted meat hung carefully from beams. For a brief moment, the peasant's belly is full, and there is a sense of security. But always, there is the question, will it be enough? Will the stores last the winter? If the harvest was poor, if rain came too soon, if pests infested the fields, then hunger lies ahead. There is no certainty, only hope mixed with dread. Winter is endurance. The fields are empty, the earth hard as stone. Work continues, but it shifts. Animals must be tended, tools repaired, clothing mended. The hearth burns constantly, fed with whatever wood can be gathered, the smoke curling into the cold air. Meals shrink as stores diminish. Thinner pottage, smaller loaves of bread, meat stretched with beans or cabbage. Hunger gnaws, slow and steady, never quite satisfied. Illness thrives in the cold, and many do not see the spring. And yet, life continues. The family gathers closer to the fire, stories told more often, prayers spoken with greater urgency. The year turns, and hope waits for the thaw. Religion marks these seasons as much as the weather does. The peasant's calendar is filled not with dates, but with saints' days, feast days, fasts, and festivals. Lent brings fasting, Easter brings celebration, midsummer brings fires and dances, harvest brings blessings, Christmas brings both joy and solemnity. The church bell rings, summoning all to Mass, to confession, to baptism, to burial. Every life begins and ends beneath that bell in the shadow of the church. The priest stands as mediator between the villagers and God, his Latin words incomprehensible yet trusted, his rituals binding the people together in shared faith. Obligations to the Lord persist through every season. Some days are given over entirely to his fields, his repairs, his demands. Tithes must also be paid to the church, 1/10 of the harvest set aside for God. Between Lord and church, much of the peasant's labor vanishes before it ever feeds his family. And yet, resistance is unthinkable. The order of the world is fixed, unquestioned. The peasant knows his place as surely as he knows the cycle of the seasons. Evenings in winter bring a different rhythm. With little light, little food, and little warmth, the family gathers close. The mother spins wool, twisting fibers into thread, her hands moving steadily by firelight. The children listen to tales of saints, of miracles, of kings long past. Sometimes a traveling peddler passes through, bringing news from distant places, strange goods, or stories of lands beyond the horizon. These stories are marvels, yet they seem as unreal as dreams. For the peasant, the village is the world, and the world is the village. The passing of years is marked not by birthdays or celebrations of age, but by milestones of survival. A child reaching adulthood, a marriage arranged and blessed, a harvest completed, a death mourned. These are the markers of time. There is no sense of progress, no ambition for change. Life is a circle, not a line. It turns and turns, as it always has, as it always will. And as the circle repeats, the peasant accepts it quietly. His life is ordinary, painfully so. Yet in that ordinariness lies the strange peace of a life tied so closely to the earth, to the seasons, to the rhythm of survival. It is a life that lulls, a life that soothes, a life that tells itself again and again, until one can hardly tell one day from the next. The seasons in the village rolled forward like the turning of an ancient wheel, steady and predictable. And yet each passing day seemed to leave behind a faint trace of weariness, as if the world itself remembered the weight of centuries of toil. For the medieval peasant, life was not measured in years, but in harvests, in rains, in frosts, in the slow growth of children and the withering of the old. Time was not an abstract notion, but something seen in the ripening of barley, the gathering of hay, the thickening of wool on sheep, the gathering of smoke in the thatched rafters of homes during long winters. A peasant's body was both tool and measure, carrying scars from childhood accidents with axes or plows, bearing calluses on palms and soles, stiffened knees from endless crouching in fields, shoulders pulled forward from hauling sacks of grain. To wake in the morning meant stretching these aches away, knowing that new ones would take their place by nightfall. It was not that they complained often. Complaints were wasted breath, but that the rhythm of labor had written itself so deeply into their existence that rest was simply the absence of movement rather than a true recovery. Food shaped life as much as toil. Bread was the core of the diet, often dark, coarse, filled with grains and husks that gave it density and toughness. The bread was not the soft, airy kind known today, but heavy loaves baked in village ovens, sometimes shared among several families. To eat bread was to taste the earth itself, the soil where the barley and rye had grown. Alongside it might come thin pottage, a watery mixture of beans, peas, onions, leeks, or whatever scraps could be thrown into the pot. Meat was scarce, usually appearing only during feasts or as salted remnants saved for special occasions. More often, a villager would chew tough cheese or sip ale, the latter safer than water since fermentation killed what the eye could not see. Meals were not grand gatherings but functional pauses. In the morning, workers ate quickly before heading to fields. At midday, a break offered another hunk of bread and perhaps some small onions pulled from the soil. The evening meal, though modest, was the one time when families could linger, the dim firelight softening the edges of the day's exhaustion. Children, still restless with energy, might play with wooden toys carved by their fathers or older brothers, while mothers spun wool or patched clothing, the thread slipping endlessly between fingers. Life in the home was centered around the hearth. The fire was rarely allowed to die completely, for relighting it was tedious, and its warmth meant survival. Smoke blackened the rafters, leaving streaks across the wood and thatch. Beds were shared, stuffed with straw, covered by rough woolen. Blankets. Privacy was nearly non-existent. The family slept together in the same room, and in the colder months, animals might even be brought indoors to keep warm. A pig or goat tethered in a corner was not unusual, their breaths mingling with human ones in the stale air. Clothing was practical, rarely changed, and often patched until fabric could hold no more thread. Men wore tunics and hose, coarse and earth-colored, cinched with a simple belt. Women wore long woolen dresses and aprons, head coverings protecting them from weather and marking modesty. Shoes, when they had them, were made of leather that wore thin with constant use. Washing garments was not a daily habit, but an occasional one, the effort too great for constant upkeep. The smell of wool, sweat, and smoke lingered on everyone, a natural perfume of the medieval world. The calendar was not marked by numbered days, but by holy days, feasts, and saints' celebrations. For peasants, the church provided rhythm and a sense of order. Sundays were for Mass, where Latin words, unintelligible to most, washed over villagers like waves. They knelt, crossed themselves, listened to priests speak of heaven, hell, and the salvation of the soul. Religious festivals brought moments of respite. Feasts, games, dances, sometimes traveling performers. On such days, laughter returned to the village in abundance, and the shadows of labor seemed to recede for a time. Yet death lingered always nearby. Children might die of fevers before their first year, women often risked their lives in childbirth, and men were not immune to sudden sickness, accidents in fields, or wounds from disputes. Burial in the churchyard was simple: a shallow grave, a wooden cross, a short prayer. The earth claimed the body quickly, and the village continued its work. Grief existed, but was woven into life so tightly that it was less a disruption than a constant undertone. Education for peasants was minimal if it existed at all. Most could not read or write, knowledge reserved for priests, clerks, or wealthy families. Instead, wisdom was passed through oral tradition, songs, proverbs, superstitions. Children learned by imitation, watching fathers plow, mothers spin, elders barter at markets. Knowledge of herbs, weather patterns, animal behavior, and farming cycles was their form of scholarship, and it was as vital as any text in a scribe's library. Superstition flavored daily life. A sudden storm might be seen as divine displeasure, a good harvest as a saint's blessing. Charms were hung in doorways, whispered prayers uttered before planting seeds. Fear of the unknown, disease, crop failure, famine, was tempered by rituals, however small, to bring comfort. A mother might tie a ribbon around a child's wrist to ward off evil spirits, while men crossing fields might make the sign of the cross over their tools. Markets offered a break from monotony. Once or twice a week, peasants traveled to nearby towns, bringing eggs, cheese, wool, or surplus crops to trade. Markets were bustling, filled with the smells of spices, animals, and cooked foods. The chatter of voices, the calls of merchants, the laughter of children running between stalls, it was a reminder that life extended beyond the boundaries of the village. Returning home, villagers carried salt, cloth, or small luxuries, each purchase carefully considered, each coin precious. Seasons dictated everything. Spring demanded planting, summer required constant tending, autumn was for harvesting, and winter for endurance. Winter nights were long and harsh, with frost creeping under doors and snow weighing down roofs. Work did not cease but shifted indoors, mending tools, weaving, carving, preparing for the next cycle. The cold pressed into bones, and hunger often gnawed more sharply in these months. Yet around fires, stories were told, of saints, of long-past kings, of battles and miracles, giving warmth to imagination, if not always to the body. The life of a medieval peasant was not filled with grandeur, nor with great dramas, but with persistence, to wake, to work, to eat, to rest, to repeat. That was survival. It was not a life of choice, but of necessity, bound to the soil, bound to seasons, bound to obligations to lords and priests. And yet, within this ordinariness, there was endurance, a quiet strength that carried humanity forward across centuries. For the peasant, greatness was not expected. What mattered was living another day, feeding one's family, keeping fire alive through the night. The castles, the wars, the politics of kings, all were distant echoes, heard faintly but rarely altering the soil beneath their feet. Their world was one of simplicity but also of resilience, carved slowly, day after day, into the history of mankind. The winter months pressed down on the village like a heavy, damp cloak, dulling even the simplest tasks into slow repetitions. The peasants who survived on the rhythm of the seasons knew that this was the time when life narrowed to the smallest of routines. The cold was not a sharp, biting cold, but more of a persistent, damp chill that seeped into clothes, bones, and thoughts alike. Each day, smoke from hearths rose lazily into the gray air, and each night, the faint glow of firelight leaked from the small windows of cottages built of timber and wattle, their thatched roofs holding the snow until it slid off in slow, wet sheets. Inside these cottages, the lives of peasants played out in quiet, ordinary ways. Meals were sparse and repetitive, pottage thickened with whatever vegetables had been stored from autumn, sometimes with a little grain, sometimes with a rare scrap of meat, though more often than not it was simply vegetables boiled until they were soft. The act of preparing food was unhurried and familiar, more about waiting than about doing, as pots hung over the hearth and the smells filled the single-room homes. When evening came early, as it always did in these months, the peasants would gather near the hearth. The flames offered both heat and a small sense of comfort, their crackling steady like a metronome marking the passage of long nights. Some would mend clothing, patching worn tunics or darning woolen socks, while others sat idle, their hands warmed by the fire, their minds drifting. The children would sometimes listen to a story, not one of heroes or wars, but perhaps a tale about the last harvest, about a neighbor's ox that had wandered off and been found again, or about the rare day when a noble passed through the village, on horseback. The days blurred together in this way, each one a repetition of the last, their monotony offering a strange sort of comfort. Life was not about excitement, but about persistence, about carrying on quietly until the thaw returned. At dawn, when the light crept through clouded skies, men might trudge out to tend to the few animals they kept, pigs that rooted restlessly in straw, hens that clucked dully in their coops. Water had to be broken from the thin ice that formed on barrels, and the simple act of fetching it became part of the rhythm of survival. Washing was rare, and when it did happen, it was done sparingly, often with cold water that made the hands ache. Clothes were worn until they grew threadbare, and then patched again. The people who lived this life did not expect more, and in that lack of expectation there was a kind of stillness. The world outside their little cottages, the nobles, the castles, the occasional battles fought somewhere far away, was only a faint echo. Their own world was bounded by fields, hedgerows, and the slow rhythm of days. At times, there were gatherings. The parish church remained the anchor of life, even in the quiet dead of winter. On Sundays, families trudged through snow and mud to sit together in its dim, cold interior. The priest's words were often spoken in Latin, not understood by most of the congregation, but the sound was familiar and gave a sense of continuity. People stood or knelt, their breaths rising like faint mist into the air, and then returned to their homes with little conversation. The church was not an event, not an escape, but simply another thread in the fabric of the ordinary. Evenings were long and uneventful. People rose and lay down with the sun. So in these months, rest came early. They lay beneath rough blankets, stuffed with straw, sometimes sharing body heat, sometimes whispering in the dark before sleep overtook them. The quiet was unbroken except for the occasional cry of an animal outside or the creak of wood settling in the cold. Sleep was deep and dreamless, interrupted only by the need to rise in the dark to stoke the fire, keeping embers alive so the cottage would not freeze. Day by day, week by week, the sameness continued. The peasants did not complain, for to them, this was life itself. Work, rest, food, sleep, the turn of the seasons, it all blended into a soft monotony that dulled the passing of time. To live meant to endure, to accept, and to repeat. It was not a life of greatness or of sorrow, but of quiet persistence. Occasionally, a small event would ripple through the stillness. A child lost a tooth, an animal gave birth, or a pot cracked in the fire, and had to be mended with care. These were not celebrated with grandeur, but noted, and then folded back into the rhythm of life. In a world where nothing much happened, even these small things were enough to mark the passage of time. As winter stretched on, the people waited, not impatiently, but with the steady acceptance of those who had seen many seasons. They knew spring would return. They knew the fields would need plowing, the planting would begin, and once again, the rhythm would change. But for now, life remained slow, still, and ordinary. Each night, as the fire dimmed, they closed their eyes to another day lived in quiet. Repetition. Another day much like the last. Another day that blurred into the long memory of a life that was not remarkable, but enduring. The seasons turned again, as they always did, with no ceremony, no fanfare, only the slow procession of weather and the quiet shifting of the village's labors. By now, the peasant's life had become a rhythm so familiar that the days blurred together, and yet each moment carried its own subtle variations that made it distinct enough to remember. The year had rolled past the lean stretches of early spring, the damp fields of late planting, and the heat of summer work, until at last, the earth rested under the gentler shades of autumn. Leaves browned and drifted into the thatched roofs. Smoke from the hearths curled more heavily into the cool air, and the peasant's body moved slower, weighted with the years of toil, but still steady, still capable. Life in the village was quiet, in the way that a constant background hum is quiet, never truly silent, but so familiar that it seemed almost invisible. The crowing of roosters came without pause, even when no one cared to hear them. Dogs barked at shadows, at passing carts, at one another. Children shouted, ran, and tumbled in the dirt lanes, their games mimicking the adults' work without, quite knowing it. The sound of a cartwheel crunching over stones was followed by the creak of harness leather, and in the background there was always the steady thump of mallets against wood, the rasp of a file on iron, or the faint echo of a distant church bell marking the hours, though no one counted them carefully. The peasant heard it all, absorbed it all, without ever thinking that one day he might miss such noise. Inside the home, the fire still needed feeding, the straw mattress still needed turning, the smoke still seeped through gaps in the roof when the wind blew wrong. The chores repeated as though commanded by something larger than memory. Each morning, there was bread to slice, if bread could be had, and sometimes only a bowl of thin pottage to be shared. Water fetched from the well carried the faint smell of damp stone, and the bucket rope left its familiar rough imprint across his palms. The day unfolded in a line of duties, small enough that each alone seemed meaningless, but together they formed the whole substance of survival. It was during the 7th year of this steady life that the peasant began to notice how differently the younger ones moved about the village. His own children, no longer infants, had grown into youth with strong limbs and quick steps. They no longer clung to their mother's skirts or cried at night. Now they were sent to herd the geese or gather sticks, and they returned muddy, scraped, but smiling. There was something strangely reassuring in this, the knowledge that they would one day take on the same endless cycle, and that the village would continue even when his own body no longer had strength for the plow. It was not an ambitious thought, nor a proud one, but simply the truth as it had been for generations. At the edge of the fields, the woods thickened into shadows where the trees leaned heavily over the paths. The peasant walked there often to gather branches or search for mushrooms, and each time he felt the same slight unease. Stories of wolves still lingered in the minds of the older villagers, though few had seen such a beast in years. Sometimes, a snapping twig or sudden rustle of leaves made him pause, yet nothing emerged but a startled hare or a bird taking flight. The woods were not dangerous so much as indifferent, a place where the human presence felt small, temporary, almost unwelcome. He would return to the open fields with a sense of relief, glad again for the smoke of the chimneys, the chatter of the neighbors, the visible signs of people enduring. Autumn was also the time of the harvest feast, when even the poorest in the village were allowed to forget their hunger for one night. A pig was slaughtered, apples stored in barrels were shared, and ale flowed with unusual generosity. Music filled the air, simple tunes on pipes and fiddles, rough but cheerful, and the peasant found himself smiling despite aching joints. Children danced in clumsy circles, the men stamped their feet, and the women's voices rose together in laughter. For a little while, the endless grind of labor receded, replaced with warmth and a fragile sense of joy. It was fleeting, like the glow of a candle guttering in the wind, but it was real, and it was enough. Winter crept in behind that celebration, as it always did. The nights grew long, the frost crusted over the edges of the fields, and the village huddled indoors more often. The peasant mended tools by the hearthlight, his hands clumsy in the cold, while his wife spun wool into thread, her fingers moving with quiet patience. Outside, the animals shifted in the byre, their breath rising, like mist in the chill. The silence of snow brought a new sound, the crunch of footsteps across the hardened ground, the muffled thump of logs dropped on the pile, the crackle of firewood splitting in the flames. The peasant grew used to those sounds, just as he grew, used to the thin meals of winter, the slower pace of work, the endless waiting for spring. There were no great events to mark these years. No kings rode through the village, no armies clashed nearby, no sudden fortune arrived at the door. The Seu peasant's world was too small for such dramas. Yet within that smallness, a kind of life unfolded that was so steady it seemed timeless. A child's laughter echoed down the lane. A neighbor leaned on his spade to share a complaint about the soil. A crow circled overhead, its harsh cry briefly piercing the dull sky. Each detail was simple, but together they formed the fabric of existence, a fabric worn thin in places but never entirely torn. Sometimes the peasant would sit at the doorway of his hut and simply look across the fields, letting the silence stretch as far as it could. His eyes followed the rows of crops, the leaning fences, the pale smoke curling upward. There was no deep thought behind it, only a strange acceptance, a recognition that the world was neither cruel nor kind, but merely present, unfolding as it always had. In that stillness, he found a quiet that needed no words, no explanations, only the steady rhythm of breathing in and breathing out, while the ordinary life of the village continued all around him. The bells of the village church marked the passage of time in a way that felt both steady and eternal, as though life itself were measured not in days or weeks, but in the endless tolling of metal against air. For the medieval peasant, the bells dictated everything: when to wake, when to gather, when to labor, and when to pray. And so life continued, one moment flowing into the next like water in a narrow stream, unhurried, unremarkable, and repetitive in ways that were almost comforting. The days might be filled with toil, but the rhythm of them never truly changed. When morning broke, there was no rush of activity like in some imagined, bustling marketplace. Instead, there was a sluggish, steady beginning. The family stirred from their bed of straw, brushing away chaff that clung stubbornly to their clothes. The air in the small hut was cool, with faint beams of light filtering through the cracks in the wooden shutters. A single clay pot of water sat near the hearth, its surface reflecting the pale gold of dawn. This was the water they had fetched the evening before from the communal well, and it would serve them through the morning for washing hands, dampening bread, or cooling the heat of an early fire. The peasant woman placed a log into the hearth, blowing softly on embers that had been kept alive through the night beneath a mound of ash. It was a small triumph each morning if the fire sparked quickly, for it meant warmth could return without the effort of flint striking again and again. When the flames caught, there was a gentle crackle, and the familiar smoky scent filled the one-room dwelling. The children shifted beneath their woolen blankets, rubbing sleep from their eyes, already accustomed to a life that began with hunger. Food was not an abundance to look forward to, but a necessity doled out carefully, measured in portions that must last. Bread, as always, was the heart of their breakfast. The loaf, dense and coarse, was cut into pieces. It was stale, as most bread, was after a day or two but softened in the warm broth left from the night before. It became edible again. The broth itself was little more than water flavored faintly by barley and the bones of a chicken boiled until all essence had been taken. Yet, for those who lived within the narrow confines of survival, it was enough. The family sat close to the hearth, sipping, chewing slowly, not speaking much. Words were unnecessary in the dull repetition of their mornings. There was a quiet acceptance of sameness that seeped into their bones as naturally as the chill of the air. Once the meager meal was done, the man of the house stepped outside into the open field that stretched beyond the village boundary. The ground was damp with dew, the grass heavy with droplets that clung to his rough boots. His task was no different from what it had been the day before, to tend to the strips of land assigned to him, small pieces within the Lord's larger domain. He carried a simple wooden tool, worn smooth from years of use, and began the slow process of turning soil and checking for weeds. The sun, still low in the sky, gave off only a muted warmth, and the silence of the fields was broken only by the cawing of distant crows and the lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the hedgerows. This work was not the work of ambition or glory. It was the endless maintenance of survival. The furrows had to be kept straight, the weeds plucked, the soil aerated. His back ached from the repetitive motion, but he did not complain, for complaining would change nothing. The land did not listen, nor did it forgive idleness. His world was bound by obligation to the soil, to the seasons, to the Lord whose wealth rested upon the efforts of men like him. There was a strange peace in that lack of choice, as if freedom had no place in a life so utterly defined by necessity. Meanwhile, in the village, the woman carried out her own duties, which were just as repetitive and predictable. She fetched water from the well, balancing the weight of the bucket against her hip as she walked the dirt path. Other women were there too, their movements as practiced as her own. They did not chatter endlessly, but exchanged brief nods, the occasional murmured word. Each was caught in her own cycle of tasks, washing, mending, grinding grain, spinning wool. It was not a life of leisure, but of endurance. Even rest itself was functional, a pause in movement rather than true escape from duty. Children played in the yard, but even their games carried the echoes of work. A stick became a plow. Stones marked out furrows in the dirt. They mimicked their parents not because they longed for the labor, but because they knew no other world. Their laughter, when it came, was subdued, quickly swallowed by the stillness of the village. Theirs was not a childhood of toys or abundance, but of gradual preparation for the life they would inherit, a life where play gave way seamlessly to responsibility without a single defining moment of change. As the day stretched on, the rhythm of labor continued, slow and steady. The sun climbed higher, its warmth heavy but not unbearable. Meals were brief pauses, hardly distinct from the work that surrounded them. Bread again, perhaps with a little cheese if the household was fortunate, or a piece of onion to add sharpness to the blandness. Hunger was never truly satisfied, only quieted long enough to keep moving. And so the hours passed, each indistinguishable from the next. By evening, the peasant returned from the fields, his shoulders slumped, his hands roughened by soil and sweat. The village came alive in its own quiet way, not with merriment, but with the simple act of gathering. Neighbors exchanged brief words, updates about the weather, the condition of crops, the health of animals. These were the only stories that mattered, for they were stories of survival. News of the outside world rarely reached them, and when it did, it felt like something belonging to another existence entirely. Kings and battles were distant, almost dreamlike compared to the immediate reality of whether the wheat would grow tall or if disease would strike the cattle. The fire in the hearth burned again, filling the home with a soft orange glow. The children lay on the straw, drowsy from a day of movement, their small hands still smudged with dirt. The woman mended clothing by the firelight, her needle passing through cloth with slow, careful precision. The man sat, silent, watching the flames. His body ached, but it was an ache he had known so long that it felt as natural as breathing. The crackle of wood and the faint sound of wind outside filled the silence, and the family drifted toward sleep once more, ready to repeat the same pattern when the church bell tolled again. This was life, painfully ordinary, without grandeur or spectacle. Yet within its dull rhythm was a strange, enduring constancy, a cycle unbroken by time. Each day mirrored the last, and each night gave way to the same dawn, as though the peasants lived in a world untouched by change. And for them, that was enough. The days in the village rolled forward like a wheel, turning slowly over uneven ground. By the time late summer arrived, the peasants had settled into the rhythm of their work once more, though the memory of winter's hunger and spring's anxious. Planting still lingered in their minds. Every sunrise meant another round of small duties, never glorious, rarely new, but familiar enough to provide comfort in repetition. For a peasant, routine was safety, and safety was as close to happiness as most could hope to come. The peasants rose at dawn, their eyes heavy from sleep, their backs still aching from yesterday's labors. There was no such thing as a day without work. Even on Sundays, when they gathered at the church, chores pressed upon them before and after the prayers. The animals had to be fed, the bread had to be kneaded, the water had to be carried. Fields could not be left untended simply because the calendar declared a holy day. Instead, the difference was merely that the plow was put aside for a little while so that knees could bend on cold stone floors. The air of the village smelled of earth, of hay, of manure, and of smoke from the ever-burning hearths. Every house carried that same scent, a mixture of necessity and survival. Inside, the peasants moved about their cramped homes, where the same few belongings were shared among generations: the wooden bowls, the crude benches, the iron pot blackened from years of fire. These were not possessions meant to impress, but to endure. If something broke, it was patched. If it could not be patched, it was kept anyway. Because even broken, things sometimes found use again. The children, growing lanky and restless, were learning to take up more tasks. A boy of 8 could already be seen shooing the geese away from the garden or following his father into the fields with wide-eyed seriousness. A girl not much older would help her mother stir the pottage or carry wood for the fire, her small arms trembling under the weight. Play existed, yes, but even games were lessons in disguise, imitations of adult labor that would soon become reality. Childhood was brief, and the line between child and worker blurred quickly. The lord of the manor appeared less often, his concerns drifting far beyond the thatched roofs of the village, but his presence was never forgotten. His steward, a man sharp with numbers and sharper with his tongue, came to collect dues. Grain measured by the bushel, eggs counted by the dozen, sometimes a chicken or a rabbit delivered as rent. The peasants gave what they must, grumbling only under their breath. Open complaints did not change obligations, and silence was safer. The Lord's Hall seemed like another world, one of stone walls and tapestries, but it was a world that could reach into their cottages whenever it pleased. As the harvest drew nearer, talk of the weather consumed their minds. Every cloud was studied, every breeze interpreted. A heavy rain could rot the crops, a sudden frost could undo months of back-breaking work. Too much sun meant shriveled stalks, too little meant weak growth. They spoke of the sky as if it were a capricious master, one whose moods shifted without warning, and to whom they must bow their heads. Nights stretched long again, though not yet with winter's bite. In the dim glow of tallow candles, families sat quietly. Some mended tools, some wove baskets, some carved small items of wood. Stories were told, always the same ones, half remembered and half imagined. A tale of a wolf seen near the forest, a ghost that haunted the crossroads, a distant war that no one in the village would ever truly see. These stories did not stir excitement so much as provide familiarity, a rhythm to the silence of night, a way to fill the hours before sleep. The church bells rang with steady insistence. Feasts, fasts, saints' days, all marked time as surely as the turning of the sun. The peasants obeyed, for obedience was less tiring than resistance. Lent meant leaner meals, no matter how little they had to spare already. Easter brought some joy, though modest, with extra bread or a rare piece of meat. Christmas, too, gave the promise of warmth and community, though the gifts were nothing more than shared food and simple carols sung in cracked voices. Marriage in the village remained as practical as ever. Love was spoken of rarely, for affection was a luxury, not a necessity. A girl was married when her parents decided the time was right, and a boy accepted the bride chosen for him without much question. The joining of households was more about labor and survival than passion. The bedding was plain, the feast modest, the toasts brief. What mattered most was that two people could now share the burden of toil. Death, too, came quietly, as it always did. A fever swept through the cottages. taking the old first and then a few of the young. No physician came, only whispered prayers and the stubborn will of bodies to survive or not. Burials were swift, the earth turned over with the same shovels, used to tend the fields. Grief was present but muted, for survival left little room for endless mourning. The dead were remembered in passing, folded into the rhythm of the village life, their absence marked by an empty stool, a missing hand at the plow. The peasants' lives were not grand, not filled with glory or legend. They were small lives, lived close to the soil and close to hunger. Yet within that smallness lay endurance. Each dawn brought them to their feet again. Each dusk found them weary but alive. The world beyond their fields might have shifted with wars, kings, and crusades, but here time seemed almost still, a slow cycle of labor and rest, want and plenty, silence and prayer. To an outsider, it might appear unbearably dull, unbearably hard. Yet to those who lived it, it was simply life. Ordinary, steady, and enduring. A life where greatness was not expected, only survival. And in that slow rhythm, that endless cycle of planting and reaping, of waking and sleeping, lay the quiet heartbeat of history itself. The life of a medieval peasant, after all the centuries have passed, might seem almost unbearably ordinary. No grand castles, no royal decrees etched into memory, no battles sung by bards or etched into chronicles, just the small grind of days, stretching one into the next, dawn breaking, tools in hand, soil tilled, seed sown, beasts fed, prayers whispered, and then dusk arriving with tired limbs and a quiet hearth. Yet even in the stillness of such lives, history itself was woven, not by kings and queens alone, but by those who bent their backs to the earth. Peasants rarely traveled far beyond the boundaries of their village. Most would never see a town larger than a market square, nor a building higher than the church spire. Their world was small, often no more than a handful of miles across, but within that small circle was an entire existence, laughter around fires, whispered rumors of lords and wars, festivals that felt like great wonders, births that brought hope, and deaths that reminded them of life's fragile thread. Food was always a concern. Some years the harvest was generous, other years the rains failed, or the frost came too early and bellies tightened through the winter. Hunger was a familiar companion, shaping not only bodies but moods. Yet when food was plentiful, there were feasts, not the rich banquets of nobles, but roasted meat shared in portions, bread fresh from the oven, and ale brewed thick and hearty. Children remembered these moments as if they were magic, and parents stored them as blessings against the years that were lean. Marriage was rarely about romance. Families arranged unions for survival, the combining of fields, the sharing of labor, the hope that children would carry the family line and tend the earth as their parents had done. But affection grew nonetheless, sometimes deeply, sometimes not at all. A stolen glance in the market, a whispered word on the path back from church, the quiet comfort of a spouse's presence by the fire, these were as real to peasants as the royal proclamations that never reached their ears. Illness was constant. A simple cough could spiral into death. A cut in the wrong season could fester and end a life. Children so often born were also so often buried, their graves marked by wooden crosses that soon faded into the earth. And yet, life persisted. People kept having children, kept planting, kept praying, kept believing that tomorrow would come, and with it, perhaps, some small measure of better fortune. Religion was the thread that bound peasants to something larger than themselves. The church was not only a place of worship, but the center of the calendar, the source of stories, and the guide for morality. Bells rang to mark the hours of the day. Holy days gave respite from endless toil. Sermons reminded peasants that their suffering had purpose, that their struggles were not forgotten by God. Whether they believed every word or only clung to fragments, faith gave them structure when little else could. Children played when they could. Simple games with stones, sticks, or bits of cloth. They ran in fields, climbed fences, stole apples when no one was looking. Their laughter echoed across the village lanes, brief reminders that joy was possible even in a world of hardship. For them, the future was uncertain, but in those moments, the present was enough. Peasants worked together as much as they worked alone. A neighbor's barn burned, and others helped rebuild it. A harvest threatened to rot, and extra hands came too. Cut and gather. Life was communal, survival often dependent on the goodwill or necessity of others. There was gossip, too, sharp tongues and whispered rumors. Someone always owed someone else a favor, or a grudge lingered over a broken promise. But in the end, when wolves howled or famine struck, the community bound itself together because it had to. Their lives left little mark in chronicles. No poems of their labors filled great halls. Their names were etched in parish registers at best, or forgotten entirely at worst. And yet they were the majority, the nameless, faceless tide that made the world turn. Without their labor, kings would have had no armies, nobles no banquets, priests no congregations. Every grand story of the medieval age rests upon the quiet, endless toil of peasants who will never be remembered, and perhaps that is what makes their lives so hauntingly fascinating. For while we can name the emperors and lords, the saints and villains, we cannot name the woman who baked bread for her children in a thatched hut, or the man who spent a lifetime repairing tools, or the child who laughed by a muddy stream before, fading from history. Yet they were as real, as alive, as vital as any crowned head. They lived, they struggled, they loved in small ways, and then they died. The fields they tended grew over, their cottages fell to ruin, their bones returned to soil. And all that remains is the knowledge that they once were. That behind every medieval chronicle, every war, every edict was 1,000 peasant hands unseen, unheard, and unrecorded. And so the question lingers, even as we close this long, slow journey through their world, if their lives, so ordinary, so unmarked by history, were still meaningful, then what does it mean for us centuries later to remember them at all?